This is a consistent agenda from our president who is focused on reworking our economy. And all you got to do is look at the pattern to see how this is an attack on working Americans. You think about it right now where they're removing food assistance from vulnerable Americans. You think about it where they're taking actions that are increasing the cost of health care that we're paying. They pass hidden taxes in the form of tariffs that are increasing costs for small businesses and consumers. They're increasing or decreasing, what I should say, taxes for wealthy Americans. And then today, the very institutions that are supposed to protect us, they're systematically working to defund them. And that's what's going on right now. And this is an agency, you got to remember this, that has been working on behalf of everyone since 2011 and has provided more than $20 billion of funds back into the pockets of Americans. This is the same agency that stopped Wells Fargo.
You just heard it, and you need to understand precisely what moment we are living through, because 22 attorneys general from across this nation just filed suit to stop the Trump administration from defunding the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which will run out of money in mere weeks. And let me tell you, this is about so much more than bureaucratic funding fights or regulatory turf wars, because what we are witnessing right now in real time is nothing less than the complete and total dismantling of the only federal agency that has ever truly stood between ordinary Americans, the insatiable predatory appetite of Wall Street and the big banks. And you heard that Attorney General lay it out with surgical precision when they described the pattern, because it is a pattern, and patterns reveal intentions, and the intention here is so transparent it would be laughable if it weren't so utterly devastating to working families across this country. Think about what this AG just articulated, because they are connecting dots that the mainstream media refuses to connect, and here we have food assistance being slashed for 42 million low-income Americans, tariffs functioning as a $1,200 annual tax increase on average households, hitting working people the hardest because lower-income families spend a greater share of their budget on imports which are specifically cheaper alternatives to domestic goods, and Trump's tariffs are almost tailor-made to devastate them, while simultaneously we see tax cuts flowing upward to the wealthy elite. And now this, the systematic defunding of the one agency that has returned more than $20 billion to consumers who were cheated, scammed, and defrauded by financial institutions. And I need you to grasp the historical significance of what the CFPB represents, because this agency was born from the devastating collapse of the banking system in 2008, when millions of Americans lost their homes, their savings, their entire economic security, while the architects of that catastrophe walked away with golden parachutes and bonuses, and Elizabeth Warren conceived of this bureau precisely because the regulatory structure had failed catastrophically, with oversight responsibilities scattered across multiple agencies, creating gaps that left consumers vulnerable, confused. So the CFPB consolidated those protections. Since its inception, it has helped consumers to the tune of $21 billion through monetary compensation, loan principal reductions, canceled debt, and more, which means this is not some abstract policy debate. This is $21 billion actual dollars that went back into the pockets of people who were robbed by institutions that knew exactly what they were doing. Let me paint you a picture of what the CFPB has actually accomplished, because Wells Fargo employees opened roughly 1.5 million deposit accounts and more than 2 million deposit and credit card accounts total that may not have been authorized by consumers, transferring funds from authorized accounts to temporarily fund these new unauthorized accounts, all driven by sales targets and compensation incentives, allowing employees to earn additional compensation while racking up fees and charges, and the CFPB fined them $100 million for that particular fraud, and then years later ordered Wells Fargo to pay more than $2 billion in consumer redress and $1.7 billion in penalties for a cascade of additional violations, including wrongly reporting customers as deceased, overstating attorney fees that meant applications were denied instead of approved, and bringing thousands of wrongful foreclosure actions. And this is just one bank, just one institution. And the CFPB caught them again and again because that is precisely what this agency was designed to do. But here is where it gets absolutely infuriating, because under the Trump administration, much of the CFPB has been gutted, with the agency preventing many of its staff from doing their work, and the administration has tried to fire most of the CFPB staff, though those attempts have been blocked by the courts, and now Acting Director Russell Vaught's decision will virtually guarantee the agency runs out of money in January. By refusing to request funding from the Federal Reserve, which is the mechanism Congress specifically established for this independent agency. And let us be absolutely clear about what is happening here, because a legal opinion from the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel concluded that because the Federal Reserve was not currently reporting combined earnings as defined under Dodd-Frank, The agency couldn't lawfully access funds, but lawmakers had intended the term combined earnings to mean the wider funds or proceeds coming into the Fed, not some narrow definition of profits that the administration is cynically deploying to justify strangling this agency to death. And you need to understand the sheer authoritarian audacity of what Trump is doing here. Because Congress created this agency, Congress established its funding mechanism, Congress gave it a mandate to protect consumers, Congress created the CFPB as part of Dodd-Frank, and as a result, the agency cannot be legally eliminated through a unilateral executive act. Yet here we are with the executive branch simply deciding that laws passed by the legislative branch do not matter, that the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution is merely a suggestion that can be ignored whenever it proves inconvenient to the project of serving corporate power. And you heard the Attorney General describe this as an attack on working Americans, and that is exactly what it is, because when you strip away consumer protections, when you defund the agency that processes complaints and holds predators accountable, when you eliminate the mechanisms through which ordinary people can fight back against institutions with armies of lawyers and unlimited resources, you are declaring open season on the vulnerable. The CFPB has returned more than $21 billion improperly taken from over 205 million Americans throughout its 14-year existence. In 2024, the CFPB received 3 million consumer complaints, including 8,800 from Oregonians, which was a 51% increase from the year before, and companies provided more than $700,000 in direct relief to Oregon consumers after those consumers made complaints through the CFPB portal, which demonstrates that this system works, that when you empower an agency to actually advocate for people instead of corporations, those people get justice, they get their money back, they get accountability, but all of that disappears if Trump succeeds in his demolition project. And now let me connect this to the broader systematic assault that the AG referenced, because the big beautiful bill will cut about $186 billion from SNAP funding through 2034, affecting more than 42 million people who depend on this program to afford groceries, making it the largest anti-hunger program in the United States. And during the government shutdown, USDA froze SNAP funding beginning November 1st, the first time that has happened since the program began 6 decades ago, and 2 federal judges ruled this pause is likely unlawful, and that Congress provided more than $5 billion in emergency funds for exactly this kind of situation, and the judges said the administration not only can use the money, but must, yet the Trump administration fought tooth and nail to avoid providing full benefits, and Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins threatened to cut off federal funding to Democratic-leaning states over alleged refusal to share SNAP program data, and said the administration will begin to stop moving federal funds into those states starting next week until they comply with weaponizing food assistance as a tool of partisan political warfare. Think about the cruelty embedded in that approach, because we are talking about 1 in 8 U.S. residents getting an average of $187 a month per person in SNAP, with nearly 39% of recipients being children and adolescents under 18. And the Trump administration is playing games with whether these families can eat, threatening to withhold benefits, demanding data in unprecedented ways. Agriculture Secretary Rollins made her case for sweeping changes by asserting the agency uncovered massive fraud in state data without providing underlying data or details, creating a narrative that stigmatizes people seeking food assistance, while the actual fraud rates tell a completely different story. But facts do not matter when your goal is dismantling the social safety net brick by brick. And then we have the tariffs, which Trump sells as protecting American workers, but Penn-Wharton budget model projects Trump's tariffs would reduce GDP by about 8% and wages by 7%, with a middle-income household facing a $58,000 lifetime loss. Tariffs have increased prices for household appliances by 5.6%, fruit by 5.5%, and meat by 6.2% from March to November 2025 compared with pre-tariff price trends, while 49,000 manufacturing jobs were lost from January to September 2025 and 58,000 from April to September, which utterly demolishes the claim that tariffs would revive American manufacturing. Budget Lab analysis shows tariffs could lead to almost a 4% drop in purchasing power of lower-income families, costing them about $1,500 annually, functioning as regressive taxes that hit lower and middle-income folks who spend more of their money on food, energy, clothing, and auto parts harder than wealthy people who spend a smaller percentage on goods. So Trump promised to bring costs down, but every single policy he implements does the opposite. This is what late-stage capitalism protected by authoritarian political power looks like, my friends, because you have a president who came into office promising to be a champion of the forgotten American, of the worker, of the person struggling to make ends meet. And what has he delivered? The facts make clear the working class is suffering under the Trump administration, and without job creation, strong wage growth, or robust worker protections, his actions leave the working class defenseless in the face of greater increases in living costs, including the loss of 361,000 jobs formerly held by working class people, while simultaneously gutting the one federal agency specifically designed to prevent financial institutions from exploiting those very same people. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Trump administration is literally defunding consumer protection while corporate predators are licking their chops at the feast that awaits them. And I want to dwell for a moment on Wells Fargo specifically because this institution has become the poster child for everything that is broken in our financial system and everything the CFPB was created to address, because Wells Fargo is a corporate recidivist that puts 1/3 of American households at risk of harm, with 1 in 3 American households as customers affected by its corporate culture and business practices, and the litany of enforcement actions is staggering because in 2015, CFPB ordered Wells Fargo to pay $24 million in penalties for its role in an illegal mortgage kickback scheme. In 2016, it paid $4 million for scamming student loan borrowers, then $100 million for fake account fraud, and in 2018 the CFPB assessed a $1 billion fine for illegal fees and insurance, practices in auto and mortgage lending, and the list could go on from defrauding the government to labor abuses and more. Which means this is not one bad actor making one mistake. This is systematic institutional corruption, a business model built on fraud, and the CFPB kept catching them, kept fining them, kept forcing them to return money to the people they stole from. Now imagine what happens when the CFPB disappears, when there is no federal agency with the resources and mandate to investigate these practices, to process the millions of complaints, to force these institutions to make consumers whole. Because completely defunding CFPB will have devastating impacts on consumers and severely disrupt states' consumer protection abilities, which rely on consumer complaints and data from CFPB. Attorneys general across the country rely on the CFPB for consumer complaints and other data to get justice for consumers, which means when Trump kills the CFPB, he is not just eliminating one agency, he is crippling the entire ecosystem of consumer protection that states and advocacy organizations depend upon to do their work. The banks know this, the predatory lenders know this, the scam artists know this, and they are absolutely salivating at the prospect. Let me invoke some political theory here, because what we are witnessing is a textbook example of what political scientists call regulatory capture, taken to its logical authoritarian conclusion, where instead of industries merely influencing the agencies that regulate them, instead of subtle corruption and revolving doors between government and corporate boardrooms, we have moved to a phase where the regulated industries can simply eliminate the regulatory apparatus entirely through their control of the executive branch, and this should terrify anyone who understands how power operates in advanced capitalist societies, because the genius of the New Deal and the regulatory frameworks that emerged from it was recognizing that markets left entirely to their own devices produce catastrophic outcomes for ordinary people, that you need countervailing power, you need institutions that can check corporate predation, and Trump is systematically destroying those institutions one by one while claiming to represent working people. The historical parallels are striking because we have seen this story before in the era that preceded the Great Depression, when finance was largely unregulated, when consumer protections were minimal, when corporate power was essentially unchecked, and we know how that ended with economic collapse, with mass immiseration, with the destruction of millions of lives and fortunes, and it took the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal coalition to rebuild a regulatory structure that could prevent that kind of catastrophe from recurring, and now we are watching that entire architecture being demolished in the name of deregulation, in the name of economic freedom, in the name of getting government out of the way, which are always and everywhere the rhetorical cover for allowing the powerful to exploit the powerless without constraint. Shortly after taking office, the Trump administration launched a campaign of destruction and systemic shuttering of the CFPB, threatening catastrophic harm to hardworking families and consumer financial markets nationwide, and court filings indicate the acting director is poised to delete entire CFPB databases, lay off as many as 95% of remaining employees, and return the agency's funding to the Federal Reserve, although these efforts were temporarily blocked, so they want to not only defund the agency, but destroy the institutional knowledge, delete the records, eliminate any capacity for this work to continue, which tells you this is not about efficiency or streamlining government. This is about obliteration. This is about ensuring that consumer protection as a federal function ceases to exist. And when you step back and look at the totality of what this administration is doing, the AG is exactly right to describe it as a systematic attack, Because you have food assistance being cut, you have tariffs functioning as regressive hidden taxes, you have healthcare costs rising, you have tax cuts for the wealthy, and now the defunding of consumer protection, and every single one of these policies has the same effect. They transfer resources and power upward from working people to corporations and the wealthy elite. And this is not accidental. This is not incompetence. This is the deliberate reconstruction of American political economy to serve capital at the expense of labor, to serve the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, and it is being done with brazen disregard for law, for precedent, for democratic norms. Because when you have power, why bother with the pretense? Since its creation in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the CFPB has been the target of many conservatives who argue that the agency is too aggressive when it comes to enforcement and that it's not accountable enough to Congress. And let us decode that language, because when they say too
aggressive, they mean it actually does its job. When they say not accountable to Congress, they mean they cannot control it through the normal appropriations process, that it has independent funding that insulates it from political pressure, and that is precisely why it was designed that way, because the architects understood that consumer protection cannot be subject to the whims of politicians who are bankrolled by the very industries being regulated. The independence of the CFPB is not a bug. It is the core feature that allows it to function, and Trump is exploiting a contrived legal interpretation to destroy that independence.
Now think about what ordinary Americans are facing in this moment. Because if you are someone who gets scammed by a credit card company, if you are someone whose mortgage servicer misapplies your payments, if you are someone whose car gets wrongfully repossessed, if you are someone whose bank charges you illegal fees, you currently have recourse. You can file a complaint with the CFPB. You can potentially get your money back. You can be part of an enforcement action that holds these institutions accountable. But if Trump succeeds in killing this agency, all of that disappears, and you are left alone, facing a multi-billion-dollar corporation with infinite legal resources, and you have essentially no power, no leverage, no mechanism for justice, except perhaps a lawyer. You cannot afford to hire for a case that might take years to resolve, and even if you win, the corporation has already made billions from the same practices applied to millions of other people who will never sue. This is why systemic enforcement matters. This is why we need federal agencies with real power and real resources, because individual litigation is not sufficient to constrain corporate predation. You need agencies that can investigate patterns of abuse, that can bring industry-wide enforcement actions, that can extract penalties large enough to actually change corporate behavior. And when you eliminate those agencies, when you defund them into non-existence, you are effectively declaring that corporate criminality, now legal, that fraud is a legitimate business model, that working people are simply prey to be exploited, and there will be no consequences. Acting Director Vaught took a novel position that the agency can only be funded by the Federal Reserve's profits, which he asserted are currently non-existent, and therefore made the decision not to request any funding, making it all but certain that CFPB will run out of funding completely in January 2026, and his decision not to seek any funding is unlawful and unconstitutional, according to the Coalition of Attorneys General bringing this lawsuit. And they are absolutely correct, because this is executive usurpation of legislative power. This is the president deciding that laws passed by Congress can be nullified through creative interpretation and bureaucratic maneuver. If this stands, if Trump can simply defund an agency by refusing to request the funding that Congress established as its mechanism, then what is to stop future presidents from defunding any agency they dislike? What happens to the EPA when a president decides climate regulations are inconvenient? What happens to the Department of Education when a president wants to destroy public schooling? What happens to any check on executive power when the executive can simply refuse to implement the laws? The constitutional crisis here is profound, because eliminating CFPB funding violates the separation of powers, as Congress created the agency and established a clear funding mechanism through the Federal Reserve, and the attorneys general are seeking a court order to prevent this constitutional violation. But we are dependent on the courts to check this abuse, and given the composition of the federal judiciary after Trump's first term, given the Supreme Court's increasingly aggressive conservative majority, there is no guarantee that the legal system will protect the CFPB or the millions of Americans who depend on it, and that uncertainty itself is part of the authoritarian playbook, because when people cannot rely on institutions to function as designed, when norms are shattered, when law becomes negotiable rather than binding, you create the conditions for arbitrary rule, for the exercise of raw power unconstrained by procedural or substantive limits. And I keep coming back to the $21 billion, because that is not an abstract figure, that is real money, that went back to real people who were cheated, and every single dollar represents someone who was made whole, someone who got justice, someone who had a powerful institution forced to account for its misconduct, and Trump is taking that away. He is ensuring that future victims will have nowhere to turn, that the next Wells Fargo scandal will go unaddressed, that the next wave of predatory lending will proceed without constraint, that the next financial crisis will be facilitated by the same kind of fraudulent practices that caused the last one, because the watchdog will be dead. This is class warfare, my friends, and it is being waged with precision and purpose by an administration that claims to represent working people while systematically dismantling every protection working people have, and the tragedy is that millions of Trump voters will be directly harmed by these policies. They will lose their SNAP benefits. They will pay higher prices because of tariffs. They will be victimized by financial institutions without recourse. And they will blame Democrats. They will blame immigrants. They will blame anyone except the people actually responsible because the right-wing media ecosystem has perfected the art of misdirection of channeling legitimate economic grievance toward scapegoats, while the actual predators operate with impunity. But let me be clear about what resistance looks like, because the 22 attorneys general from Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, Wisconsin, and the District of Columbia are filing this lawsuit, and they are using every legal tool at their disposal to stop this assault. And that matters because in a federal system, state power can serve as a bulwark against authoritarian overreach. State attorneys general can sue state governments, can refuse to cooperate with unconstitutional federal directives. State institutions can maintain protections that the federal government abandons, and we need to be supporting these officials. We need to be demanding that every blue state, every purple state, every locality where progressives have power, use that power to resist, to protect, to preserve what can be preserved, while we fight to reclaim federal power. The fight ahead is existential, because if Trump succeeds in killing the CFPB, it will embolden every other attack on every other protection, on environmental regulation, on labor rights, on voting rights, on civil rights, because the lesson will be that executive power is limitless, that Congress is irrelevant, that courts can be ignored or captured, that the only thing that matters is who holds power and what they choose to do with it, unconstrained by law or precedent or democratic accountability. And that is the definition of authoritarianism. That is how democracies die. That is how you get oligarchy, where the wealthy and powerful write the rules, and everyone else simply suffers the consequences. So when you hear that attorney general describing Trump's war on workers, when you hear them connecting the dots between food assistance cuts and tariff increases and tax cuts for the wealthy and the defunding of consumer protection, understand that you are hearing someone describe the reality of this moment with clarity and courage. And we need more of that. We need more officials willing to name what is happening, willing to fight back, willing to use every institutional tool at their disposal to stop this demolition of the regulatory state and the social safety net and consumer protection. And we need movements in the streets demanding that our government serve people, not corporations, demanding that economic policy be evaluated by how it affects working families, not by how it affects profit margins, demanding that we build an economy that works for everyone, not just those at the top. The stakes could not be higher, because $21 billion returned to consumers represents millions of individual victories, millions of moments where the system worked, where justice was possible, where ordinary people could fight back against extraordinary power, and Trump is trying to ensure that those victories never happen again, that consumer protection becomes a relic, that we return to the Gilded Age, where corporations were sovereign and workers were disposable, and if we let that happen, if we do not fight with everything we have, then we will have failed not just this generation, every generation that comes after, because rebuilding these protections once they are destroyed takes decades of political struggle, decades of organizing, decades of fighting against entrenched corporate power that will never voluntarily surrender the advantages that deregulation provides them. This gear is the fire, and this is the fight, and this is the moment where you decide whether you are going to be complicit in this destruction through silence and inaction, or whether you are going to stand up and resist and demand something better, demand an economy that serves human needs, demand a government that protects the vulnerable, demand a system where $21 billion going back to cheated consumers is just the beginning of what justice looks like in America.